All right, AP Human Geography students, welcome to the review for the Unit 7 exam, which is our last unit of the year. It is going to cover both development and industry, which is found in chapters 10 and 11. So a little bit about the exam. It's 61 multiple choice questions, two 5-point matching questions, and then the traditional 15-point vocab section. There will also be an FRQ if you are in Mr. Sheridan's class, but if you're in Mr. Starr's class, there will not be an FRQ. This should be a timed assessment. You should pace yourself, and finish within an hour of the multiple choice section, and then 25 minutes to complete the free response, right? We're not holding you to that, but it's something that you should be doing for pacing for the AP exam, right? And so we are now going to go over what you can expect to see on the exam. Keep in mind that this is tied to the review sheet. There is a review sheet to help you as well. So let's talk a little bit. We're going to start with development, and this segment is going to be primarily dealing with Chapter 10, development, right? And then I will do a separate one for Chapter 11 as well. So we define development by the process of improving the material conditions of people through the diffusion of knowledge and technology, which is really nice to say, but really we're talking about rich countries and poor countries, haves and have-nots, developed versus developing, MDCs versus LDCs, all of those things. And we can think of them as a spectrum, right? You have LDCs in kind of as less developed countries, and then you also have the least developed countries. So think sub-Saharan Africa there, right? In the middle, you have NICs, newly industrialized countries. So think your BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, as well as places like Mexico would fit in that NIC realm. And then you have MDCs, or developed countries, and think of those as going to be your North America, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand countries. All right, so we do have our developed regions and our developing regions. There's a quick look at the map. You should know these by now, probably, but there it is just for you to know. All right. And then so a big part of this is going to be talking about how we measure development, right? And remember, we use three different types of statistics: economic, social, and demographic, right? Economic is going to be money related. Social is going to be things that are basically healthcare and education based. And then demographic ones are going to be, think of things like birth rates and things that measure a population. All right. So the UN uses an index. An index is a collection of statistics called the HDI. It is comprised of GNI, which is gross national income, mean years of education, expected years of education, so two social statistics, and then life expectancy, which is a demographic statistic. You go from a 0 to 1 score, right? The highest at one point was Norway. The lowest was Nigeria at 0.34. Right. And so you can see down here, it does look at, right, these dimensions, right? Long and healthy life, there's life expectancy, decent standard of living, there's GNI, and then knowledge, right? And that's your schooling, right? Mean and expected years. So there's your HDI in a very teal map. Look at the darker spots again, and then look at sub-Saharan Africa. So you should be well versed in what a development map looks like. Right, and this would be a pretty good example of that. So, a couple things way we measure economic indicators. Gross domestic product is another way we measure that. Right, so it's the value of all goods and services produced within or by a country in a year. Right, think of it as often divided per capita. Per capita is great because it gives you a mean, right? Measures mean wealth, but it does not measure distribution of your income within a country. So a couple, if 5% of the population controls 55% of the wealth, right? That doesn't necessarily, that leads 95% of the population that's going to be relatively poor, right? Another key component to measuring development is the sectors, right? The sector of jobs, primary sector, which is going to be farming generally, right? Secondary sector, which is going to be your industry, and then tertiary sector is going to be your service sector. right? So keep that in mind, right? So understand those and understand what they measure and how they measure that. Right. So here's GDP per capita in 2017. Notice this is a decent development map, right? But you do have your Southwest Asian, right, Middle Eastern countries measuring pretty high there as well. All right. Again, we look at primary sector, secondary sector, and tertiary sector, and how these intersect with development. Right. Note that the United States has a lot of services. Services are heavily tied to development because people have money to pay for services, whereas farming and primary sector stuff is tied to less developed countries because they do not have the agricultural technology, right? The productivity that goes with a tractor or all of the things that go with agriculture in a commercial agriculture setting, right? So think subsistence culture. Tie that back to your agriculture unit as well. All right. We can also tie this back to the demographic transition model. If you think of stage 2 as developing countries, you think of stage 3 as NICs, and you think of stage 4 as MDCs or developed countries, right? You're going to be sitting pretty well, right? So that's basically what you can expect when it comes to population. Right, so you're going to see high birth rates in less developed countries or developing countries, and you're going to see low birth rates in developed countries. All right, which leads us then to GNI, right, which is similar to GDP, but it does give us a global context. So it's produced, it's monetary worth produced within a country plus income received from investments minus payments to others, right? So it's looking at, it takes trade into example, it takes globalization, it takes corporations and things like that. And so if you look at, remember that the developed world, right, is only 1/5 of the population, right? So that purple part is only 1/5 of the population, but it accounts for almost half of the GNI. That's the total GNI in the world, right? So that's kind of the haves and the have-nots. Another important piece is PPP, right? You'll see that in your vocabulary section as well, right? What is purchasing power parity, right? And that is basically an inflationary measure, right? So it's a measure of how many units of currency are needed by in one country to buy the amount of goods and services that one unit of currency will buy in another country. So it's how much bang you can get for your buck, right? It is how many items of something you can get for a set amount of money in one country compared to another country, right? And sometimes they'll use the Big Mac index, how many Big Macs it takes, how much money does it take to buy X amount of Big Macs in a country from one country to the next. All right, informal economy is something you should think about as well. It's an activity that's neither taxed nor monitored by the government, right? It's not counted in terms of your GDP. You're going to see this in less developed places. You're going to see this kind of under the table type of things. You're going to see this with the undocumented workers. So remittances and cash would be a good example of the informal economy. You'll see this in squatter settlements, right? So it's something to think about as we go through what the informal versus the formal, right? Because this is an entire other segment of the economic activity, and just because it's not taxed or monitored by the government doesn't mean it doesn't exist and isn't an important piece for a lot of people in the world. Right. Other things to look at when it comes to economic indicators: number of phones, TVs, cars, stuff like that, access to internet, stuff like that. All right. And then productivity, right, is a pretty important piece, right? The value of a product compared to the labor dollars, right? So how productive are your workers, right? And MDC workers are much more productive because they have the machines, the tools, and the equipment. Oftentimes they have the training as well, right? It doesn't mean that they're inherently harder workers. It doesn't mean anything like that. Don't put a judgment value on it, but it does mean that they are able to do more things because they have tools, equipment, and machinery, right? Automation to do the stuff that would normally be done by human hands in a developed or a developing place. All right, on to social indicators. These are going to be basically education, health, and safety, right? Things that we measure: literacy rate, student-teacher ratio would be educational measures, calorie consumption, hospitals, doctors, nurses per capita, right? And then healthcare expenditures, how much you're going to spend. Although we do need to put an asterisk on that because the United States spends more money on healthcare than any other country, but we have for a developed country, we have a lower lower. We have a higher infant mortality rate. We have a lower life expectancy. We have a higher maternal mortality rate. So things like that to think about, right? Other things to think about. What are other indicators that could represent development? All right. So there's student-teacher ratio. Notice that it's lower, right? In developing places, you can see that. You can see mean years of schooling, which is one of the HDI measures, and you see that. What you're seeing is a development map, pretty decent, right? Expected years of schooling, you're going to see that. Maybe a little less in terms of a development map, but you do see indicators between the developed regions and then sub-Saharan Africa. There's quite a bit of difference there. There's calorie intake, right? Note that in the lightest part that is below 100, that means we're looking at a deficit in terms of not getting enough calories in a day, the recommended 2,000 calories in a day. There's doctors per capita, right? And then we get into our demographic indicators of development. So life expectancy, right? Infant mortality rate, natural increase rate. So again, tie that back to natural increase rate and birth rate. You can tie that back to the DTM, right? Demographic transition model. Dependency ratio is going to talk about that. If you have a high dependency ratio of older people, that probably means you have a higher life expectancy. So you're looking at that piece. Whereas if you have a bunch of young people, 0 to 15, in that dependency ratio, that probably means you're a less developed place, you're a stage 2 country. Gender balance is another one to think about. If you have more women than men, women live longer, so you have a higher life expectancy, right? If you have more men than women, that's going to be generally a less developed place because you're going to have a higher maternal mortality rates. So there's life expectancy at birth. Look at the difference between a developed and a developing country is very interesting. If you look at the top there, that's kind of an interesting, a very good statistic with that. All right. So we've only talked about a country to country comparison. But if we're looking at inequality adjustments, right, modifies HDI to account for inequalities within a country. So think of that, right, when we go back to what our mean is, right, in terms of, GDP per capita or something along those lines, or GNI per capita. And it, again, does not account for discrepancies, right? This does, right? It compares the HDI numbers in terms of demographics within a country, right? And the lower the IHDI number, the more inequalities there are within a country, right? So notice the vast difference. It still does measure development, right? You do see that there's bigger differences in less developed countries, right? And a lot of that is going to have to do with gender, which we're going to get into as well. All right. Something to think about: core peripheral model, world systems theory. Is done by Emanuel Wallerstein. You should understand what that is. Note the core and the periphery. Think of them as MDCs and LDCs. Think of the semi-periphery as NICs that sometimes look developed and sometimes they don't look very developed. And so we like this in that it does take into account that the core basically uses the periphery, right? And the periphery is being used by the core. And so that's how they stay where they are, which makes it a lot harder for a peripheral country to become more developed, right? Because they're being used for their cheap labor and raw materials, right? And then are being sold the consumer goods that are created in the core. All right. Also think about the core peripheral model as there's a separate thing called the core peripheral model, which expands on the world systems theory. And again, that we like this as well because it does break it down in terms of scale. You can talk about this in terms of anywhere from urban areas, right, from cities to global things, and it adds a different piece. Instead of having the semi-periphery, you have an upward transition and a downward transition area, right? But the industrial core is going to be your core. Your resource frontier is going to be your periphery. All right. Understanding other models, neocolonialism, right? Also known as post-colonialism, talks about how colonialism is still alive and well, even though most places aren't colonized anymore, as you learned in your political geography unit. But there's economic colonialism that still happens. So that's something to think about. It's another way to look at it. It has elements of the core peripheral model, in that it does talk about kind of the inequalities between places, right? With this also comes structuralist theory, which is essentially related. It's another thing that is related to neocolonialism, right? And basically it says the structure, right, is stacked for MDCs or developed countries at the expense of developing or LDC countries, right? And this is again is going to go against Rostow and the ladder of development theory. And then dependency theory is another piece. It's a form of structuralist theory. Honestly, understanding that neocolonialism, structuralist, and dependency theory all kind of work the same way, and there's elements here and elements there. You're probably not going to have to know the differences between those. Just understand that this is a way of thinking, right? This is another way of thinking that really talks about kind of why poor countries are poor and why rich countries are rich, because the rich countries are using the poor countries and the poor countries are being used by the rich countries. With that, we start looking at inequalities. We can talk about that within the United States, right? And we can also talk about it within places like Brazil. All right, so remember that inequalities exist within countries. China is a good example, right? The coastal Chinese cities are much, much more developed than the inland, largely agrarian provinces. All right, on to gender. Again, remember the UN says there is no country has perfect gender equality. Women are not treated better or the same in any country in the world, right? And there are statistics that back that up. That is a true statement, right? MDCs, though, the good news is you who are living in an MDCs generally they're closer to equality than LDCs. Right. So how do we measure this? We have the GII, which is a lot like the HDI, except it just compares men and women, right, in terms of their level of achievement using reproductive health, empowerment, labor market, stuff like that, right? And then there's the GDI as well, which looks like the HDI, but it compares the two statistics, or the statistics in each country, breaks them down between male and females, and if there's vast differences between males and females, then you get a lower score. Right, so there's GII, Gender Inequality Index. Again, you see this as it is a gender map, right, or a development map. Sorry. So we are looking at that correlation between closer to equality in developed places and further away from equality in developing places. Right. So again, things to think about: things like gender empowerment, right? The number of people, number of women who are able to achieve economic and political power. So how many CEOs are women? How many legislators are women? How many executives are women? Things like that. Right. Also looking at employment, right? The having women in the workforce also gives you a good indication of development, right? That is a measurement of development. Although again, we look at sub-Saharan Africa, right, and the southeast corner, you do see that comparable and even better, right, in the workforce than the United States. So it's something to think about. Other things we look at: reproductive health, adolescent fertility rate, right? Teen moms, essentially what we're looking at. And you note the difference between developed 16 versus developing. Something to add there, right? Maternal mortality rate is also pretty important. That's the number of women who die in childbirth. And the difference between developed and developing is vastly different here, right? So there you go. There's some statistics and then the maps that go with those statistics: adolescent fertility and maternal mortality rate. Again, you can see the developmental differences are pretty high in terms of coloring there. So how do LDCs become MDCs, right? How do we look at that? We're looking at two different models here: the self-sufficiency model and the international trade model. And so things to think about when it comes to that: how does it, what are policies that a country does, right, and kind of philosophy, right, on how to achieve development, how to increase your development. So the first one we're going to look at is the self-sufficiency model. It's also known as the balanced growth model, right? And that's where you go away from international trade. You kind of try to block imports and competition with your domestic businesses and industries by doing things like adding high tariffs, right, and kind of insulating businesses from MDC businesses, and trying to eliminate maybe unfair competition from MDCs. Um, so what you're going to see is a balanced but small growth, right? It's called balanced growth because you're going to see equal income in urban and rural reducing, and trying to reduce poverty in both spots, right? You're also going to see all economic sectors, right? And that's going to try to lead to moderate growth across the board, not just in one sector of an economy. So it is an interesting way to look at things, right? It's closed off, and we will see that it isn't necessarily the best when it comes to in trying to improve your country. Right. So the problems with this, and again, they're going to use India as a case study, right, is that you protect unproductive businesses. If there's no competition, there's no incentive to get better, right? So when the government controls prices, there's no foreign competition. There's not a lot of motive to get better, right? To reduce costs, to increase your quality. You get into a bit of a monopoly situation there. Right. And in order to keep the self-sufficiency model, you need a very large government. Right. So you have a huge bureaucracy, big government, which can be, that can lead to abuse and corruption. Right. And if you're spending all your time enforcing the policies, those people could also then be doing something that's just a little bit more productive, like working in industry, something along those lines. Right. So there's India as a case study, right? They cut off the self-sufficiency model about in 1990, and you can see by 2017 that this looks pretty good, doesn't it? All right. So that leads us then to the international trade, right? And that gets us into the ladder of development, or Rostow's ladder of development, right? And that's where a country focuses on specific resources, right? And the comparative advantages that they have, what's going to make them better at producing something. And that's going to help promote growth in those areas. And then those areas are going to take off. So it starts off in 5 stages. You have your traditional society, right, which is generally an agrarian society, a low-income country, right, a poor farming country, right? But the government then invests in technology and infrastructure in a niche economy, right? A niche part of the sector. So maybe that's windmills or something along those lines, right? And so they get really good at making one thing and they sell it on the international market, and that then brings income into, right, that these in the takeoff stage, you see income and money come into the country, right? So they're starting to make money. You see rapid growth in niche industries. It is not spread out across the board. You're not going to see this in agriculture. Or if you are going to see it in agriculture, it's going to be specialty crops, right? And from there, the increased income that comes from the takeoff of the niche industries is going to promote growth in other sectors. It's going to add a demand for skilled workers, so you're going to see more skilled workers, and so the education system is going to go there, and it's going to kind of have a snowball effect on the economy, and then all sectors are going to benefit because you're going to have more skilled workers, you're going to have growth in other sectors, you're going to have all of these things, right? And when you have income, people are going to want products, right? And so you're going to see the shift then in the age of mass consumption. The shift is towards manufacturing of consumer goods and high tech products. Right. This has happened in Europe. This has happened in North America, and this has happened in Japan. And so the idea is that if it can happen there, this is kind of the blueprint for other countries doing the same thing. Right. The problem with that is that it doesn't necessarily mean that not every country doesn't have the same benefits. Right. When it comes down, though, to the difference between self-sufficiency and international trade, right? International trade is much better, right? Countries benefit in 3 ways, right? So you see, they follow this blueprint. They have a history of that. You see the development of raw materials that exist in many countries that are less developed, right? And then you see some international competitiveness as well. Right. So the problems, though, is that you become a one-trick pony, right? You become very reliant on a single sector of your economy, and if a um, if another country becomes better at what you're doing, then you might be out of luck, right? There's global price and demand fluctuations for whatever you're doing. Maybe your product, your niche economies become out of date, or they don't grow in the same way. You also have to play with the big boys, right? You have to compete with the MDCs, and so this is where structuralism, neocolonialism, right, dependency theory comes in. The game is kind of rigged, right? So lack of local industries results in using or needing MDCs for imports, and so that can get into unfair competition stuff, right? And so with that, again, you can have market decline, you can have foreign competition coming in, and so it can be a dicey approach, the international trade approach. It doesn't always work. All right, so with that, to help promote the international trade approach, you have organizations like the WTO, right? So WTO works to eliminate trade barriers. That's going to be tariffs, right, and quotas and things like that, or like maximum amounts of things that can be traded, and enforce trade agreements, right? Protect rights with that. It does come under some consideration. WTO isn't always labor friendly, right? It's going to be more business friendly than it is labor friendly. It doesn't always protect workers, right? It's not always seen as the most environmentally friendly organization as well. Right, that it's more about trading and it's less about workers' rights and protections or the environmental protections that go with that. Right. Another way to promote international trade is direct foreign investment, or foreign direct investment, or FDI. And that's when a transnational corporation comes into a foreign economy and boosts that up. Right. The good news is that you do see that happening from MDCs to LDCs, but keep in mind that most um, transnational companies aren't based in LDCs or developing countries. They're based in the developed places, right? And so these developed places tend to trade within each other, right? They don't necessarily always branch out. So you see that difference, the difference between LDCs, right? 33% of all LDC FDI goes to China, right? Only 10% goes to Africa. So it's not spread out equally or evenly, right? And MDCs and MDCs tend to invest in each other and not necessarily in LDCs. Right, so you'll see some WTO protests there. You do see some growth in foreign investment happening, right, in places like Latin America, but you've seen a dip with that as a reaction to the economy as well, right? East Asia, you see a lot. Latin America, you see a lot. You don't see as much in places like Sub-Saharan Africa, which desperately need it. All right. So again, we look at sources of HDI. You see the connection between development, right? Europe and North America are over half of all FDI compared to the rest of the world, right? And the destinations then tend to go as well. They tend to play, right? The Europeans and North Americans tend to spread that, tend to stay within that realm, right? And whereas the rest of the world doesn't always see as much FDI. Right. And again, you kind of see where it goes and where it doesn't go. You see Brazil being in there. You see Southeast Asia. You see a lot of China happening as well. All right. So if you are looking to increase your development and you need money to do that, there are places to do that. Two organizations we look at when it comes to that. How to fund your development would be World Bank loans and IMF loans, or the International Monetary Fund. Right. So the difference between those is that the World Bank uses funds to develop. They use funds and they fund government programs, right, to develop financial institutions and build transportation products. Um, so they're project based, right? Whereas the IMF is money based. It's loan based to kind of stabilize economies, and it's more we need money because we're broke, as opposed to we need money with the World Bank. We need money to fund this project. Right. So it's not as specific in an IMF loan. So there are two ways to do that. and we look at where those World Bank loans are coming from, you don't see loans in developed places as much. There are some, but you are going to see that in BRIC countries, right? Note the connection between NICs here. That you don't see a lot in developed countries, and you don't see it a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, but you are going to see it in emerging economies or BRIC or NICs, right? So if you're looking at how to not use the IMF or the World Bank, because they are controversial and their systems are sometimes being accused of favoring MDCs over LDCs. One way to go around that is microfinance, right? And these are called microloans, otherwise known as microloans. And it's an alternative source of loans, right? You're going to give them on a kind of a small business or individual basis in developing countries, right? The best example of that is the Grameen Bank, which really, really helped rural women, right? In terms of increasing their ability to make a living through a lot of fair trade handicrafts, a lot of textiles that go with that. Right. The connection to gender is very interesting in that if it's given to a woman as opposed to a man, there's a better chance the loans are going to be paid back, which is that's fascinating on a sociological level, right? Remember, only 1% of loans have been failed to pay back. Um, and then you were looking at what a loan is just about $60, but $60 can go a long way in a less developed place, and gets people to increase their development and gets them on their feet, and then they can start to roll. So it's a way to do that. Places like Kiva, an organization called Kiva is another way that you can do microloans. Right, it'll help you do that. Right. So with this, let's talk a little bit about the IMF and the World Bank, right? And on those loan programs, right? The idea is to improve infrastructure, and that will attract business, right? If you don't have proper electricity, you're probably not going to get a factory coming your way, right? Same with sewage, hydroelectric power, stuff like that. And then the idea then is like once you have something that attracts business, then you'll have the money that will help pay back the loan, right? But things can go wrong, right? If your development program fails, either through faulty engineering or poor management or criminal activity amongst those who, embezzlement and fraud and stuff like that, then businesses aren't going to come, right? And then you get into a loan payment where you owe the World Bank or the IMF a lot of money, and then they come in and they do something called a structural adjustment program, and they control your economy. They tell you what you can and cannot do because you owe them money, right? So it's risky, right? There's some risk. And we look at LDC debt. And we look at where that is. You can see that is spread out throughout developed places. That most places have in developing places have some debt. All right. Other ways we can measure, are we making progress? We can look at, GNI per capita. We can look at education, life expectancy, all of those things, and we can see that progress has been made. That this is coming around. All right. That leads us to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, right? These were developed by the UN. These goals were adjusted to be 2015. There was something called the Millennium Goals, which are really, really cool, but they really didn't necessarily play out real well. So we've adjusted all of those to do the Sustainable Development Goals and added another 15 years onto this, right? If you look at this, number one is to end poverty in all forms, and it goes into sustainability, right? It talks about inequality, sustainable energy, gender equality, inclusiveness, education measures, health measures, all sorts of great things, right? And this is like what the UN wants to help do that, right? And so, and it is working, right? But it's not as fast as people want, right? So the last thing we're going to talk about, we talked about microfinance and microloans, but we can also talk about fair trade, right? If you're worried about your transnational corporations not doing what they should be doing and kind of structuralist and neocolonialism stuff, it can be kind of a downer when you're trying to buy products. Fair trade is your answer to that, right? Fair trade, our products are made and traded according to standards which protect LDC workers and businesses, right? So standards are going to be set by nonprofits. You're going to see a lot of cooperative, fair wages, safety regulations, and all of those things. And fair prices for products are going to be big time things, right? And then you'll see a reinvestment part that goes with it as well. Good examples of that are going to be crafts. Coffee, fair trade coffee is pretty standard. If you are buying coffee, most fair coffee that you can buy is fair trade, right? It's almost a prerequisite. Bananas, cocoa is very important too, right? Because chocolate has a dark history when it comes to how people who work on cocoa plantations are treated, right? And so that is it for chapter 10, the development, right? And you will also have a chapter 11 review that is available too. So good luck, and we will see you soon.